Maid's daughter was set up on a joke date. The truth turned the tables. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It's a tale of unexpected twists, where a maid's daughter proves that the truth has a way of turning the tables, even in the most unlikely of situations. The story starts at an extravagant party, one that could only be described as the epitome of wealth and exclusivity. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, casting soft light on the marble floors below. The laughter of the elite echoed through the grand hall, as wealthy businesspeople and socialites mingled with glasses of champagne in hand. At the center of it all, in a room filled with the world's most powerful people, stood a young girl who didn't quite belong. Amelia was just a maid's daughter. Her clothes were modest, her shoes worn from years of use, and her face a bit too youthful to blend into the crowd of polished executives and CEOs. Her mother had been working at the mansion for years, quietly maintaining the estate, and today, Amelia had been invited, reluctantly, to attend the lavish event. She was told to stay out of sight, be as invisible as possible, and not cause any disruptions. But Amelia had no idea that she was about to be the center of a cruel prank that would make her the subject of ridicule. The host of the evening, a billionaire businessman named Richard, had decided to play a joke. He had his staff set up a mock blind date for Amelia. They told her it was a simple dinner, but they had arranged for her to meet one of Richard's most arrogant friends, someone who would humiliate her for sport. Richard, along with his guests, thought this would be a laugh, a way to entertain themselves at the expense of someone who was considered beneath them. Amelia was left unaware, sitting at the table, waiting for her date to arrive. As the minutes passed, she tried her best to stay composed, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. This wasn't her world, but her mother had insisted she attend. The moment her date arrived, it was clear that things were not going to go well. The man, dressed in a sharp suit, sauntered into the room with a cocky grin on his face. He took one look at Amelia, scoffed, and immediately began making cruel remarks about her appearance, her status, and even her family. He mocked her clothes, calling them vintage in a way that made it clear he didn't think they were stylish, but rather outdated and embarrassing. The guests in the room erupted in laughter, and Richard smirked from across the table, delighted by the spectacle. But Amelia, though humiliated, sat in silence, keeping her composure. She had been taught by her mother to never let the cruelty of others show. But what Richard and his guests didn't realize was that Amelia was not just a maid's daughter. She wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. Behind her quiet demeanor lay a sharp mind, one that had been sharpened by years of observation and learning, even though she wasn't given the chance to showcase it. As her date continued to mock her, Amelia finally spoke. Her voice, though soft, cut through the room like a knife. She looked at him and simply said, "You have no idea who I really am, do you?" The room fell silent, and Richard's smirk faded. The guests looked at each other, confused, unsure of what was happening. Amelia took a deep breath, then revealed the truth that no one saw coming. She was no ordinary girl. Amelia had grown up learning about fine art, history, and even languages from her mother's years of secret tutoring. While her classmates were out playing, she was at home, reading books and learning about the world in ways no one expected. And now, the truth would come to light. Richard, who had thought he could have fun at the expense of someone less fortunate, would soon learn that the tables were about to turn. Amelia wasn't just a maid's daughter. She was a hidden talent, a force to be reckoned with. The guests were left speechless as Amelia, in front of everyone, proved that her mind was far sharper than they could ever imagine. It was a moment of complete shock and transformation, as Richard's cruel joke backfired spectacularly. But the real question is, what would he do now? And how would this revelation change the way everyone at the table saw her? Stay tuned as we uncover the unexpected twists and turns of this remarkable story. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with the weight of Amelia's revelation. No one moved, not even Richard. He had expected a reaction, maybe a moment of awkward laughter, But what he got instead was a complete shift in the atmosphere. The arrogance that had once flowed so easily from him now felt out of place, like a stranger in the room. He had underestimated Amelia, and now he was about to face the consequences. Amelia stood up slowly, her eyes steady on the guests who had once been so eager to laugh at her. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but this time, she wasn't the object of mockery. She was in control. She had revealed her knowledge, her hidden talents, and now it was time to take charge of the situation. The room, which had once been filled with the sound of laughter and sneers, was now quiet, as if the entire mansion had been plunged into stillness. Richard's guests exchanged confused glances, unsure of how to respond. Amelia could feel their discomfort, but she wasn't concerned. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about proving that she was more than the stereotypes they had attached to her. She had always known her worth, but now they were seeing it too. Amelia didn't want to be the center of attention, but she also knew she couldn't let the opportunity slip by. She had waited too long to be invisible. "I'm not here to entertain you," she said quietly, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not a joke." The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. She wasn't going to play along with their cruel game anymore. She wasn't going to let them continue treating her like she didn't matter. Richard, still reeling from the shock of her words, finally spoke. "You think you're special?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Amelia didn't hesitate. "No," she said. "I think I'm just as good as anyone else. Maybe better." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not sure whether they were witnessing a moment of defiance or the beginning of something more. Amelia turned toward the long dining table, where Richard sat, his arrogance barely contained. "You wanted to humiliate me," she said, her tone cool but filled with a quiet strength. "But now it's your turn to be humbled." There was a pause, a brief flicker of uncertainty in Richard's eyes. He was a man used to being in control, used to commanding respect, but now he was facing something he couldn't manipulate. Amelia had turned the tables. She had taken their mockery and turned it into her strength. The people in the room, who had once seen her as nothing more than a servant, now saw her in a new light. They saw the power of knowledge, of intelligence, and of a quiet strength that could not be easily shaken. Richard's smirk faltered, and for the first time that evening, his confidence began to slip. He had thought this was going to be a simple game, a way to make himself feel superior, but now he was the one who felt small. Amelia had shown him that intelligence and dignity could not be bought or sold, and certainly not mocked. She had outsmarted him, and in doing so, she had proven that no one, no matter their background, was ever truly beneath anyone else. The room was still. The guests were watching, waiting for Richard's next move. But Richard remained silent, his gaze flickering between Amelia and the others in the room. He couldn't bring himself to speak, to defend his actions, because deep down, he knew he had lost. Amelia had won, and the truth had been laid bare. As the tension in the room lingered, the guests began to stir. They were unsure of how to react, but Amelia had already made her mark. She had claimed her place at the table, not as a joke, but as someone who deserved respect. Richard's plan had backfired spectacularly, and Amelia had emerged victorious. The tables had indeed turned, and the power had shifted. Amelia had proven her worth, not through force, but through knowledge and dignity. And as the evening wore on, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The people who had once looked down on her now saw her as someone they could not ignore, someone whose intelligence and strength were undeniable. The joke was on them, and Amelia was the one who had the last laugh. The tension in the room lingered, thick with anticipation. Amelia stood tall, her posture a sharp contrast to the cowering Richard, whose arrogance had faded into an uncomfortable silence. The guests, once eager to see her humiliated, now looked at her with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Richard had set the trap, thinking it would be a harmless joke. But now, he was the one caught in the snare, his pride wounded, his reputation in jeopardy. The room, once filled with laughter and mocking, had been transformed into a place of discomfort. It was as if everyone was suddenly aware of their own actions, realizing how easily they had allowed themselves to be complicit in Richard's cruelty. Amelia, however, remained calm. She knew this was her moment, the moment when everything would change. She wasn't just standing up for herself anymore. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been underestimated, belittled, or made the subject of a joke. As the minutes passed, Richard remained frozen, his mind racing for a way out, but no words came. Amelia's gaze never wavered. She had proven her point, and now, it was time to show them all the true power of knowledge and self-respect. The room was still. The only sound was the distant clink of silverware and the soft murmurs of the guests, who were now reluctant to speak. Then, finally, it was Richard's mother, an older woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, who broke the silence. "Enough, Richard," she said, her voice cool but firm. "You've humiliated yourself enough." Richard's mother was no stranger to power. She had seen her son grow up in privilege, but she had always insisted on certain values. For the first time, she seemed to be on Amelia's side, a shift that no one could have predicted. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to speak out. Richard, his face flushed with anger and shame, stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, trying to regain his composure. But Amelia wasn't done yet. She stepped forward, her voice steady and clear. "It's not ridiculous," she said, her words cutting through the room. "What's ridiculous is how easily people forget that we all deserve respect, regardless of where we come from or what we do. You wanted to make a joke out of me, but I'm not laughing." Richard opened his mouth to retort, but his words faltered. The reality of the situation was settling in. Amelia wasn't just a maid's daughter. She was a force to be reckoned with, and in that moment, she had exposed him for the arrogant, narrow-minded man he truly was. The room felt smaller now, as if everyone was suddenly more aware of their own actions, their own roles in perpetuating the power dynamics that had been on display all evening. Amelia's presence had shifted everything. The mockery had turned into respect. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was thoughtful. It was a moment of reckoning for everyone in the room, a realization that things could not go back to the way they were. Amelia had taken back control, and the people who once saw her as nothing more than a servant now saw her as someone who deserved not just their attention, but their admiration. As the evening wore on, Richard remained quiet, the weight of his earlier actions heavy on his shoulders. His guests, once complicit in his game, now found themselves wondering if they had been wrong all along. They had seen Amelia for what she truly was, not just a maid's daughter, but a person of intelligence, dignity, and strength. And though they may have mocked her at first, they now knew better than to underestimate anyone again. Amelia's triumph wasn't just about exposing Richard. It was about proving to everyone in that room, and to anyone who had ever been looked down upon, that true strength doesn't come from wealth, status, or power. It comes from within. And with that, the tables had turned, in more ways than one. As the evening continued, the atmosphere in the grand hall had completely shifted. The earlier tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent air. Richard, once brimming with arrogance, was now nothing more than a shell of his former self. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a look of confusion and regret. Amelia had turned the tables, and there was no turning back. She had proven that wealth and power meant little compared to dignity and intelligence. The room, once filled with laughter at her expense, now seemed to regard her with a newfound respect. Even those who had been silent observers were beginning to understand the weight of what had transpired. Amelia's quiet strength had unraveled everything Richard had worked to build, not just in that room, but in his entire life. It wasn't just about the humiliation of one man. It was about the lesson that had been learned by everyone present. Amelia had shown them that true power lies in the ability to stand up for oneself, to hold on to one's integrity even when the world tries to tear it down. For the first time in his life, Richard felt vulnerable. His wealth, his status, his connections, none of it mattered now. He had been exposed as nothing more than a bully, and Amelia, the one he had sought to belittle, had become the person who held the power in that room. Amelia, on the other hand, felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had fought back, not with anger or violence, but with the quiet confidence that had always been inside her. She had never asked for this attention, but now that it had come, she knew it was hers to claim. The guests in the room had seen her as nothing more than a maid's daughter, a nobody in their world of wealth and influence. But now, she had made them see that she was someone they could no longer ignore. Amelia's victory wasn't just in proving herself in front of the guests. It was in reclaiming her own narrative. She had taken back her power from those who sought to strip it away. Richard's mother, who had watched everything unfold, stepped forward. Her voice, calm and composed, broke the silence. "Amelia," she said, her tone softer than it had been earlier. "I want to apologize for my son's behavior. What happened here was wrong." Richard's mother, a woman of considerable influence, had always been the silent force behind the scenes. She had known about her son's arrogance, but this was the first time she had seen the consequences of his actions so clearly. The respect she once had for him was now tarnished, and she found herself ashamed of what he had become. Amelia nodded, acknowledging the apology, but she didn't let herself get caught up in the moment. She knew this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about the lesson that had been learned and the change that had been set in motion. The room was still, with everyone waiting for what would happen next. Amelia could feel the weight of their gazes, but she didn't flinch. She had already won. Richard, standing by his mother's side, tried to regain his composure, but it was clear that the damage had been done. His wealth and status couldn't shield him from the truth. Amelia had exposed him for what he truly was, and nothing could change that now. As the evening came to a close, the guests began to filter out, some of them still in shock, others in deep thought. Amelia remained standing, her back straight, her eyes scanning the room as if nothing had ever happened. She had proven her worth in a way no one could ignore, and she knew that this night would change the course of her life. The tables had indeed turned, and Amelia had emerged victorious. Not just in the eyes of the people in that room, but in her own heart. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had taken back her power. The night wore on, and as the last of the guests began to trickle out of the grand mansion, Amelia remained in the center of the room, unshaken. The once festive atmosphere had been replaced with a strange, contemplative silence. The guests who had once ridiculed her were now lost in their own thoughts, each reflecting on the shocking events that had unfolded. Richard, his face still flushed with the remnants of humiliation, stood by the door, his gaze fixed downward, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He had never felt so exposed. His wealth, his social status, his connections, none of these things had protected him from the truth. Amelia had revealed him for what he truly was, and there was no hiding from it now. As the final guest left the room, Richard's mother, who had remained silent for most of the evening, approached Amelia. Her eyes were no longer filled with the dismissive contempt that had characterized her earlier interactions. There was a softness to them now, a glimmer of respect. "Amelia," she said, her voice quieter than before, "I have seen many things in my life, but never anything quite like this. What you did tonight, it was incredible." Amelia met her gaze. Steadily, but her response was measured. "I didn't do it for anyone else but myself," she said. "I stood up because I had to. No one else was going to." Richard's mother nodded, understanding the weight of Amelia's words. She had lived a life of privilege, where power was wielded without much thought to those beneath it. But Amelia had shown her something profound. True strength doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity and fight for one's own dignity. Richard, still standing in the background, clenched his fists, unable to let go of the anger that burned within him. He had lost tonight, not just in front of his guests, but to Amelia. His pride had been shattered in a way that money could never fix. It was a wound that would take time to heal, and one that would remind him of his own arrogance for the rest of his life. "I owe you an apology," Richard finally muttered, his voice tight with frustration. Amelia glanced at him, her expression neutral. "You don't owe me anything," she replied. "You've already shown who you are." The apology wouldn't change that. Richard, for the first time in a long while, looked vulnerable. It was a rare sight, one that only someone like Amelia could bring about. The truth had a way of making even the most powerful men feel small. The evening had shifted from a cruel joke to a moment of reckoning. The people who had once laughed at Amelia, who had dismissed her as nothing more than a servant, were now seeing her in a new light. The woman they had ridiculed had stood tall, not with force, but with integrity. She had done what no one else could. She had made them see the error of their ways. Amelia had not just earned their respect, she had earned her place in the world. "Thank you," Richard's mother said, her voice soft but genuine. "You've reminded us all of what really matters." I hope my son learns from this. Amelia nodded but didn't reply. She didn't need to. The lesson had been learned, and for her, that was enough. As she left the grand hall, her head held high. She knew that this night would be the beginning of something new. For the first time, she felt like she belonged, not because she had been given a seat at the table, but because she had earned it. The tables had indeed turned, and now, she was the one who held the power. The days following the event at the mansion were quiet, but Amelia could feel the shift in the air. Things had changed, not just for her, but for everyone involved. The guests who had witnessed the confrontation began to treat her differently. It wasn't just out of courtesy, it was genuine respect. They saw her not as the maid's daughter, but as someone with the strength and intelligence to stand up for herself in the face of ridicule. Richard, though still deeply ashamed of his actions, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He had tried to dismiss the encounter as a fluke, but the more he replayed the events in his mind, the more he realized that it wasn't a one-time incident. Amelia had done something that most people, including him, couldn't do. She had shown him a side of himself he never wanted to see, and that realization haunted him. He began to change, slowly at first. He sought out the advice of people who would have once never been in his social circle, people who had no interest in his money or status. He started to listen more and speak less. But despite his efforts, he could never fully shake the feeling that he owed Amelia something he could never repay. As for Amelia, life returned to a quiet normalcy after the night of the confrontation. Her mother continued to work at the mansion, but now, the staff treated her with a newfound respect. Amelia was no longer the invisible girl in the background. Her quiet strength had made an impact, not just on the guests at the party, but on the entire household. The family, particularly Richard's mother, began to recognize her for her intelligence and dignity. It wasn't long before Amelia was offered opportunities she never dreamed of. She was invited to take part in discussions, given a chance to share her knowledge, and offered a position in a company that valued her talents. What had started as a night of humiliation for her had become the stepping stone to a future she could be proud of. Richard's transformation, though slow, was real. One evening, he approached her mother. His demeanor changed. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice no longer dripping with arrogance, "about what happened that night. I need to apologize to Amelia. I can't undo what I did, but I can try to make things right." Amelia's mother, who had seen so much in her life, gave him a measured nod. "It's not just about an apology," she said. "It's about what you do next. Actions speak louder than words." Richard took those words to heart. It wasn't easy for him. He had lived his whole life believing his wealth and power could solve everything. But now, he realized that true growth didn't come from those things. It came from humility and respect for others, regardless of their background. As time went on, the tension between Richard and Amelia melted away. They didn't become friends, but there was an understanding between them. They had both been changed by that night, in ways they never expected. For Amelia, the event was not just about standing up to Richard. It was about proving to herself that she was worthy of respect and recognition. She had always known she was more than what others saw, but now, she was living in a way that made it clear to everyone else as well. The respect she had earned that night continued to grow, and with it came new opportunities, new doors opening. For Richard, the night had been a harsh lesson, but it had also been a wake-up call. He learned that no amount of money could shield him from the consequences of his actions. And while he would never be able to fully undo the harm he had caused, he would spend the rest of his life working to be better, to live with the humility that Amelia had shown him in a single moment. The story had come full circle. Amelia had gone from the subject of ridicule to the person who commanded respect. And in doing so, she had not only changed her life, but had forced those around her to change as well. The truth had indeed turned the tables, and everyone involved was left to reflect on the lessons they had learned. Months passed since that fateful night at the mansion, and life had taken unexpected turns for both Amelia and Richard. Amelia, once just the maid's daughter, was now recognized for her talents, her intelligence, and her quiet strength. She had become a symbol of resilience and empowerment in the eyes of many. Her life had been transformed, not just by the events that unfolded that night, but by the inner strength she had discovered within herself. Her career had taken off in ways she never imagined. Invitations to speak at events, offers to collaborate on projects, and opportunities to lead were coming her way. Amelia had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving whatever she set her mind to, regardless of her background. But despite her newfound success, she remained grounded. She never let the fame or the recognition get to her head. For her, the real victory wasn't in the accolades or the job offers. It was in the way she had stood up for herself and demanded the respect she deserved. Richard, on the other hand, had been through his own transformation. The man who once saw people as pawns in a game of power had slowly learned the value of humility. He began to make amends for the wrongs he had done, not just to Amelia, but to others in his life. The lessons from that night had changed his perspective on everything: his work, his relationships, and the way he viewed those around him. He sought forgiveness from his family, especially from his mother, who had been deeply disappointed in his behavior. Richard's change wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, but it was real. He no longer looked at the world through the lens of superiority. He began to see people as equals, and he learned to value kindness and respect over power and influence. Amelia, though still wary of Richard's true intentions, saw the changes in him. He no longer tried to impress her with his wealth or arrogance. Instead, he had humbled himself in a way that surprised her. They didn't become friends, but they shared a mutual respect that had been absent before. Richard understood now what Amelia had always known, that no one should ever be judged by their background or their social standing. One afternoon, Amelia was sitting in her favorite quiet cafe, sipping on a cup of coffee and reflecting on how far she had come. She thought back to the night at the mansion and how, in one moment, everything had changed. It wasn't just about standing up to Richard, it was about reclaiming her own worth. She had become her own hero in her story, and that was something no one could take away from her. As she sat there, lost in her thoughts, she received a message. It was from Richard. He had invited her to meet him for a conversation. At first, she hesitated. It had been months since they last spoke, and she wasn't sure what he wanted. But then she remembered how much had changed since that night. Richard had come a long way, and maybe, just maybe, this conversation could be the final piece of closure they both needed. She agreed to meet him at a park nearby. When they sat down together, the tension that once existed between them was gone. Richard spoke first, his voice sincere. "Amelia, I want to thank you for what you did that night. You taught me something I didn't know I needed to learn." Amelia nodded, listening carefully. "I was wrong about so many things," he continued. "I was blinded by my own ego and privilege. But your strength, your courage, it's something I'll never forget. You changed me." Amelia looked at him, her eyes soft but firm. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I did it for myself. To remind myself that I matter." There was a long pause. Richard took a deep breath. "I understand," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry for everything I put you through." Amelia's expression softened, but she didn't immediately offer forgiveness. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging his words. It wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about understanding, about knowing that both of them had been changed in ways they couldn't have predicted. As they parted ways that day, Amelia felt a sense of peace. She had taken control of her own story, and now she was moving forward, not looking back. She had proven her worth, not to Richard, not to anyone else, but to herself. And that was enough. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction for Amelia. The changes in her life were becoming more evident every day. She had always been a quiet observer, watching the world around her with keen eyes. But now, she was becoming a part of that world in a way she had never imagined. Her career was taking off, and people were beginning to recognize her for the talent and intelligence that she had always known she possessed, one of apology or regret, but of respect. He wanted to congratulate her on her new role and acknowledge the incredible journey she had been on. "You've come a long way," Richard wrote. "I've learned a lot from you, and I have nothing but respect for the person you've become." Amelia smiled as she read his words. It wasn't the kind of message she had expected, but it was one that showed genuine growth. She had always believed in the power of second chances, and in that moment, she realized that both of them were on a path to becoming better people. Their story, once filled with tension and animosity, had transformed into something more meaningful. It had become a story of redemption, of growth, and of mutual respect. And while they may never be close friends, there was a silent understanding between them that spoke volumes. Amelia's journey had been one of proving her worth, not just to others, but to herself. She had fought for her place in the world, and now she was living in it. She had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. And as she looked ahead, she knew that the road ahead would be filled with even greater challenges. But now, she was ready to face them, knowing that she had the strength and the courage to overcome anything that came her way. Amelia stood on the balcony of her office, looking out over the city as the sun began to set. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and the bustling streets below seemed like a distant memory. She had come so far, not just in her career, but in her journey as a person. The challenges she had faced, the obstacles she had overcome, and the strength she had found within herself, all of it had led her to this moment. It was hard to believe that the shy, uncertain girl who had once walked the halls of the mansion, invisible and unnoticed, was now a leader, respected by her peers and colleagues. Amelia had earned her place in the world, not by chance, but through sheer determination and a refusal to let anyone define her worth. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her mother. "I'm so proud of you, my dear. You've shown everyone, including yourself, what you're capable of. Keep shining." Amelia smiled as she read the message, her heart swelling with gratitude. Her mother had always been her rock, her biggest supporter, and the person who had believed in her when no one else did. Now, as Amelia reflected on her journey, she realized that it was her mother's unwavering belief in her that had fueled her own determination to succeed. Amelia had never needed validation from others. She had always known her own value. But there was something powerful in knowing that her journey had touched others, that her courage and strength had inspired those around her. Richard's message from earlier echoed in her mind. Though they had never become close friends, there was a sense of mutual respect between them now. He had changed, and she had changed, and in many ways, they had both grown because of each other. The story of their rivalry had transformed into one of redemption. Richard's journey was one of learning humility, and Amelia's was about realizing that her voice mattered, that she had the power to change her own life. As time passed, Amelia's career flourished. She took on more responsibilities, continued to mentor others, and made a real difference in her field. Her work became her way of giving back, of showing others that their potential was not determined by their circumstances. She made it her mission to uplift those who, like her, had been overlooked or underestimated. She built programs to help young women from disadvantaged backgrounds find their own paths to success, just as she had. In every moment, Amelia carried the lessons she had learned along the way, that no one should be defined by their past, that true strength lies in perseverance, and that the greatest victory is in being true to oneself. As the years went by, Amelia's influence grew, but she never lost sight of the values that had shaped her. She remained humble, kind, and committed to making the world a better place. Richard, too, had continued on his path of self-improvement, though he was never quite the same man he had been before. Amelia often thought of him, wondering where his journey had taken him. But ultimately, it didn't matter. Their paths had crossed for a reason, and through that experience, they had both found the strength to change. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Amelia's story wasn't just about overcoming the odds. It was about the power of resilience, the importance of standing up for oneself, and the incredible transformation that can occur when we refuse to let others define us. As she looked out over the city one last time, Amelia knew that her journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still goals to achieve, but she was ready for whatever came next. Because now, more than ever, she knew her worth. And no one could ever take that away from her. Discover the incredible journey of a young girl who rises from the shadows to become a symbol of strength, resilience, and empowerment. In this gripping tale, Amelia's story unfolds as she defies the odds and challenges the wealthy elites who once looked down on her. With moments of humiliation, self-discovery, and ultimate triumph, this story mirrors the struggles and victories seen in many millionaire stories. From a quiet maid's daughter to a powerful leader, Amelia proves that true strength isn't measured by wealth, but by the courage to stand up for oneself. As she navigates the complex dynamics of power and respect, she shows us that anyone, regardless of their background, can create their own path to success. Along the way, Amelia's transformation challenges the very foundation of privilege, and her story becomes one of the most inspiring millionaire stories ever told. Watch as she not only takes control of her destiny, but also inspires those around her to rise above their circumstances. This is a powerful reminder of how the most extraordinary millionaire stories are often written by those who have the will to change their lives against all odds. Amelia's rise, and the lessons learned along the way, showcase the kind of millionaire stories that can change the way we view success and ambition. If you've ever wondered how ordinary people can become extraordinary, Amelia's story is the answer. It's a journey filled with unexpected twists, moments of deep personal growth, and the realization that wealth isn't the only thing that defines a successful life. If you want to hear more inspiring millionaire stories, follow along as we dive deeper into her remarkable journey.